Kleros and how it is a private governance solution. Also, as you know, I mean, I do like history, so let me tell you a bit how the London Stock Exchange started. So, at the beginning in the 17th century, in London, there was this place called Royal Exchange where people traded all kind of goods, like wool, cotton or whatever. And stockbrokers had a little place in the corner, and they would trade, the what was at those times, the very first, stocks from, companies, the East India Company, for example. And so at some point, when William III was the King of England, so the Parliament decides to ban stockbrokers from the Royal Exchange because, well, they saw them as doing a sort of speculative activity, and in order to try to curb that speculation, they just, banned them from the exchange place. Okay. I mean, what do you think these degens did? They just stopped, trading stocks? No, of course not. They went to a back alley, not far from the exchange, a place that now we know as a Change Street or Change Alley. Last April, when I went to London for the King's College conference, we organized at King's College about Kleros and AI and, well, decentralized justice. I took some time to actually visit the Change Alley, and I went there, and this is what it looks now. This is the kind of place where you go to buy. I mean, I don't want to say drugs, but this is a back street where you would go to buy, non very legal stuff. Dark place, and so that is where people in the early days in the 17th, 18th centuries traded, stocks, and at some point later, they moved from that alley to a coffee house called Jonathan's Coffee House, which is a very famous place where stockbrokers did lots of different type of trades. There is a book from that time called "Every Man His Own Broker," a guide to the stock exchange by this guy called Thomas Mortimer, that explains how that coffee house worked and how the rules work for people to be able to join that coffee house. And they actually did really complex, operations, really complex, like futures, like derivatives, really, really complex, types of financial transactions. And even Adam Smith, in his book on Lectures on Jurisprudence, he writes a bit about the system of reputation they had at the coffee house and the exchange alley to like ban traders who were non-compliant, traders who were like scammers. So the fascinating part of all this is that all of that was done without any intervention from the government. No, as I said, financial activity and trading stocks was not an activity that the government would want to encourage. It was seen as, some kind of degen type of activity. So that is how the stock exchange started. So for over 100 years, stockbrokers traded all kinds of stocks, doing all of these super complex and sophisticated activities without any government intervention. So they just self-regulated their activities through private rules. So it was a very cool system of private governance. So if you want to learn a bit more about this, which I do recommend you do, you can read this book called Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life by Edward Stringham, which explains a bit how this system worked. And also it explains a bit about other private governance systems, such as eBay and other internet situations and more. Why am I speaking to you about this really old stuff about the early days of the London Stock Exchange? Well, because some people, including me, think that maybe crypto as an industry is kind of in the early London Stock Exchange days, in the sense that we have this activity where we are having more and more crypto assets that are being issued worldwide and lots of different types. And we have regulatory regime, public regulation, which cannot follow, this new creation of crypto assets done by lots of different teams from different countries. Some of them are anonymous and cross jurisdiction with all of the complexity you can imagine. So it's very hard for regulators to keep, up to speed with all of this new financial system that is being created, and this increases by a lot the risk of fraud. I don't need to explain to you that because we are in a crypto audience here. So lots of scams, fake situations, and all that happens in this new world of finance. And Brennan Armstrong made this tweet a few months ago where he explained, so there is like 1 million crypto assets being created per week. So how can regulators keep up to speed with those? So it's really hard for a public regulation system to resolve this situation. And this is why private governance systems can help in this situation to reduce the risk of fraud. And guess what? Well, Kleros can be one of those private regulation systems. And we actually have been doing this for a while already. So in March 2019, we launched this app called Tokens by Kleros, where what we did is a list system where people could submit tokens, and the community would make the vetting process to see if token should be accepted or not, in order to be listed into a decentralized exchange, for example. The process works like this. So Alice wants to list a token, so she makes a submission of the token to this list, and she also makes a deposit that will be used as a bounty for people from the community to eventually, challenge her submission. And then there is a number of rules that people will check in order to see if the token complies or not. So some of those rules are about compliance and legal, others are about the team, others about the technology. So lots of different topics that are relevant, and people can check whether the token complies or not. So let's say nobody has any objection about this token, so this token is accepted into the list, and then the submitter gets back the deposit. Okay, so everyone is happy. Let's say now she wants to submit a token that is a scam or a token that is not compliant with any of some of the rules that I just mentioned. So so she makes a submission with a deposit. Bob can challenge this submission if he thinks it's not compliant. And now we have a situation of a dispute between Alice and Bob, and this dispute is going to be resolved by a Kleros panel where jurors are going to vote on whether this token complies or not with the conditions to be listed. And let's say Bob wins this trial, so the token is removed from the list, so it's not accepted, and Bob receives the deposit from Alice as a bounty for his job. I mean, for the time it took and the risk he took into challenging and going making this removal. Okay, so this is basically a private system that verifies which tokens need to be accepted into the list based on the rules that are set forward. And we have one of the most famous Kleros cases actually came from this type of use case. It was a very famous case that was called the Buyer Chain case. So in 2020, so this team called Buyer Chain makes a submission of their token to be listed, and the token gets challenged, and this goes to Kleros for the trial, and then jurors start to analyze the evidence, and one of the jurors, he sees, okay, this guy Scott Bingley, he claims to be the CTO of the project, and that's curious. This guy doesn't have many papers published. He doesn't have YouTube talks, what one would expect from a major CTO from an important project. And the Also, it said at some point in the white paper that this Scott Bingley was member of some group called the Blockchain Research Laboratories from Oxford. So one of the jurors actually called Oxford and asked for Scott Bingley, and and people answered the phone, and then they said, "Oh, look, we have no idea who Scott Bingley is, and there is no such thing as a blockchain research laboratories around here." So it was all a scam. I mean, so this was basically a stock photo that people took and and created this fake profile. So this token, of course, was challenged and removed, and then 6 months later, we read on the news that so this project called Chain had been classified as a Ponzi by the Chinese police department, and there was a number of arrests and etc. So imagine if Kleros had been used by the Chinese police to verify, the authenticity or the legitimacy of the project. So it could have saved like 6 months of people being scammed by a Ponzi, basically. So this is a good example of how a private system of governance can help resolve this type of problems, because there's a lot of people doing challenge and doing resolution for those challenges. And at that moment, another guy called Federico was actually at Oxford, but at the real Oxford, doing a talk in January 2020 when blockchain meets arbitration. This was the first time actually we did some activity together with Oxford, and you will see why this is relevant a bit later. But this product that I mentioned about the tokens eventually got rebranded and etc. And now this is a product we offer under the name of Kleros Scout that is used by MetaMask, Etherscan to verify smart contracts and verify that addresses are not scammy or etc. So this is a really good example of how these systems work as a private governance tool. And if you want to learn a bit more, I can recommend a few readings. So specifically about Kleros, you can see all of this challenging system in this paper by Luis Bergoya, Karen Sif, and Karen Ekin. This is called the Sheriff system. So it's a really good paper that analyzes how this private system of challenging works. And what it accomplishes is that in this world of great increase of crypto assets being issued every day, the capacity for regulation with this private governance, steroids, if you want, can increase like a lot, and then this can reduce the fraud risk by a lot. Okay, so let me just because this is a topic which is very dear to my heart, because I mean I'm from Argentina, and when you're from a country where things usually don't work, I mean the public things, I mean people resort to private governance and private regulation solutions. So I have done lots of research about this topic, and lots of the ideas that went into Kleros came from lots of these things. So if you are interested in private governance, so I recommend a few books for you. Enterprise of Law by Bruce Benson. This is like the Bible of private dispute resolution and private justice. Then the not so wild west. When you think about the Wild West, about a place with lawless, well, yeah, it was lawless, but there was a lot of rules made by institutions that were created, like bounty hunters and all that. So that helped, maintain some semblance of order, not by public means, but through private means, until the government went there. And if you have played Red Dead Redemption, you may have seen that it's kind of the transition between the times of private governance of the gunslingers to the times of the government taking over the security of the West. Okay, another great book is The Invisible Hook. So it's how pirates actually manage their governance and how they shared the booty and how they cared for those who were like injured in combat. So they have a really sophisticated, even I would say a social security system, totally private and managed by the people from the ship and the captain, and quite democratic, by the way. And another one, legal systems very different from ours. This is a really good compilation of some of this, it also mentions the private system of the pirates. It mentions the Greek system on which Kleros is inspired. So this is an amazing book. Also the Iceland system of the sagas, on which some of the research we are currently doing with William is inspired. Finally, The Rule of Laws by Fernanda Piria, which is a bit of a history of how these private systems helped bring order to the world, over 4,000 years, basically. And last, why am I telling you about this? Because we are super happy to have Ekin Jeng, who is doing his doctorate in law at Oxford. And Ekin is researching private governance system, private legal systems. And at Kleros, we are supporting his doctorate with a partnership. So we are super happy to welcome him here, and so he can tell us a bit about his studies and about him. Hello, Ekin. Welcome to our call.
Hello, good to be here.
Well, welcome. I'm happy that we can be starting our collaboration. I mean, tell us a bit to our community about you. I mean, what is your research? How you got interested into the topic, so people get to know you a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Ekin. I'm originally Turkish. The whole idea came out of a presentation I did at the DL News company retreat years ago. So I tested the idea there. DL News is where I work as editor-in-chief, by the way, sister organization of DeFi Llama, which tracks DeFi analytics, as those in the community will know. And essentially, it's the research title is Decentralized Finance as Private Order, and it goes to the ideas Federico has masterfully covered. And I'm so glad I don't have my slides up, because I was going to cover the same basics as he did, including this very book that I have on my desk. Excellent book. Right, so the idea is pretty much like the stock exchange example Federico gave, and indeed others, that tight-knit communities can generate social norms, maintain social norms, and they can maintain a sense of order without the need for, state courts, state law, or in the scholarship we say state legal systems. But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily antagonistic to the state. The one definition in the scholarship we see is that the private orders are usually in the shadow of the state, right? So sometimes states come into play, sometimes there are conflicts, sometimes private orders turn to states for help. So that's the general framework. And as to how that applies to DeFi, if you've been in, crypto, blockchain, you'll be familiar with the question, what maintains order in DeFi, or maybe you'll be more familiar with the one of the answers to it, which is code is law. And then the second answer, which Federico, you also mentioned, that without the state there shall be chaos, right? There's this idea, and we see in the press, mainstream press, they call crypto, DeFi, they call it the Wild West. And I often like to give example and I move on to say, well, it's not necessarily the Wild West, but that book you showed, I think, is maybe an answer to, well, maybe Wild West is not really wild after all, right? It has its own internal logic, which is true. We see it like the book you showed, we see it with the pirate communities, and also with like prison gangs. David Skarbek has this interesting book on the order of the underworld. Mafia, all sorts of organizations can have their internal logic. And that seems to be very common with merchant communities, fishing communities, and traders, and indeed finance historically. There seems to be something about money being at stake, perhaps, that like ties people together, and perhaps some sort of expertise. Anyways, without getting to in details here, I'll just mention that usually to question what maintains order in DeFi, in scholarship and in the industry as well, and in mainstream media, we see two answers, right? One is Code's law, which I call techno-determinist idea, because it assumes that technology is what maintains order. It's all smart contracts, it's mathematical logic algorithms, and completely ignoring the human discretion that exists everywhere, from DAO governance to snapshot, and the informal mechanisms. Think about like SEAL 911, this group that intervenes every time there's a hack. Then we've got like oracles. I mean, even Kleros is one example, right? That people coming together to debate. There's a lot of human discussion. There's a lot of human involvement. It's not all automated. So the idea that Code's law is unsatisfactory for that reason. And then the other idea, of course, what I call legal centralism, and that's the idea that the state law is the only source of law, only source of order. That's also wrong, because we know historically that we've lived in legally pluralist societies. There have been different sources of order. The book by David Friedman and others is an example of that. Lots of examples here. I mean, Jewish law is the most common one, but like medieval Iceland is one thing you mentioned. Maybe that's an old example, but in the scholarship today, the most famous example, and that's one that still lives on today, is the Jewish diamond traders in New York. And as to and the question, of course, like, why do they even have that? Why don't they resort to a state court system? And the scholarship says that because diamonds are so small, high value, and they're specialist objects, they are difficult to just escalate to state court. So the communities found historically that the state courts were ill-suited for resolving their disputes efficiently. So instead they developed this, private arbitration and reputation-based enforcement system. Similarly, whaling crews in the 18th, 19th centuries, especially in New England, being so far away, from any state authority, they developed these ship's articles because they needed a way to settle their disputes. Clear self-enforcing agreements. And Japan is an interesting one. The Dojima Rice Exchange in the 18th century, Japan, in Osaka, they also relied on self-regulation because futures trading was this novel financial innovation that state institutions had neither the expertise nor the infrastructure to govern efficiently. So then the question arises, why in crypto we see such little reliance on state law, right? I have some, tentative answers. Happy to debate with anyone. One is probably the classic, the technology law gap. It's the same thing with like sharing economy, sharing platform, Uber, that sort of stuff. But that's too broad. Then there's, the technical affordances, because the way blockchain works, the smart contracts, and you deploy it anonymously, you don't have to register anywhere. That kind of allows that system to happen. Then third, you could say there are normative aspirations, and I think that is interesting. So there are like ideological underpinnings that DeFi separation from the state is actively maintained by a strong like idealistic commitments within the community, where many participants reject like traditional financial regulation, viewing it as like restrictive, opaque, and historically it didn't serve its purposes, and so on. So these are the reasons why that might be the case. So the interesting, Federico, you mentioned like, can we build like private order system? I think the question I want to tackle, I've been tackling, is, well, have we built those systems? I think evidently we kind of have. I think your question is interesting because that goes into whether these systems can survive long term, whether we can still maintain them. That's something that I also, tackle. Yeah, but the first task is to offer a third alternative to this Cody's law, techno-determinist idea versus legal centralism. The source of order is only the state. The third alternative, historically, we know that private orders have existed, and we might be seeing one emerging just in front of our eyes. I'll stop here in case you've had any questions, because I know that we want to do it a bit more interview style, but I got more to say. But maybe
I honestly, I mean, it was so clear. I mean, I didn't feel like interrupting. I would say like how. So what is the methodology you're going to use to answer to this question?
So I'm using. This is in socio-legal studies, which is the empirical social science study of the law, and it's one corner of the legal scholarship that's very receptive to this idea that law and order can come from non-state sources. So I'm using social science methods, qualitative methods. It's interviews, ethnography, so ethnography being digital ethnography. I'll be meeting some of the jurors of Kleros. So that's one example. I'm hanging out in the governance forums, on Discord. I'm on crypto Twitter all the time. I mean, working as an editor-in-chief as well at DLS, covering DeFi, I'm exposed to these ideas all the time. So methodologically, I'm very fortunate that I'm in a very, I'm in an environment that encourages like innovative methods and not so much like strict, box ticking exercise. So as long as I find answers to the questions I ask, and as long as they are reliable answers, I go with that. But broadly, it's interviews, ethnography, and the cool thing about our community, of course, the broad, crypto communities, it's all transparent. There's an emphasis on like public discussions. There's a lot of reflection on, things like Cody's law, for instance. And on top of this, there's also a lot of scholarship. And so one difference, my research, I guess, one way it differs from other scholarship is that it's quite empirical in the sense it's focused on what exists today rather than what blockchains can achieve. Because if you look at scholarship, there's a lot of talk on like the blockchain revolution and what smart contracts can do and can achieve. But we already have examples of for instance DeFi at 100, I don't know what it is today, $120 billion total value locked across all protocols. It's been working somehow, orderly with little reliance on state. So it's right there. We have mechanisms like Kleros. We have other informal mechanisms. So Kleros, I mean, we can also talk about Kleros more specifically. As I mentioned to you before, it's interesting because it's a formalized, there's formalized language around it, right? Like the tuna courts of Japan, I think comes to mind because the tuna industry in Japan developed this method of resolving their conflicts outside the state, and they use the language they borrow from state court systems. And there's something I think comforting about that because people are familiar, with those words, familiar with the ways of doing justice with the state. But of course, we are doing it without the state because the state doesn't have monopoly on justice. So yeah, that's a long answer.
I mean, one of the things I think that we did well was call it, as people could understand, but jurors, when we speak with people who come from the arbitration world, they are a bit, angry that we call this arbitration because they said, oh, this is not arbitration because it doesn't work like arbitration. Maybe in the future. So arbitration is in a broad sense you could call it arbitration, but and I think that one of the reasons of the success of Kleros is that it kind of was addressing how people saw these systems working. And I mean, even if they were not lawyers, but everyone knows a bit how legal systems work. And so the fact that we use the same vocabulary made it like close to people who, well, I mean, and you see this on the memes, about the trials, and it's very fun. And yeah, people use like your honor to address, the jurors, and so it's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, what?
Yeah. So, good points. Yeah. So whether it's private arbitration or not, of course, is one debate. And as I said before, you'll remember maybe there's a broad definition, narrow definition,
Yeah.
and if it seems to be doing something, doesn't matter what the definition is, then there are debates whether those definitions matter. But yes, I mean, that's an interesting one. And bear in mind, though, so interesting thing about Kleros, of course, that it's and correct me if I'm wrong, it's ex post dispute resolution, right? So people, when they think about private orders, they immediately think about this, right? The conflict resolution. And it's a big part of it, of course. But it's not the only part. There's a whole background to this and preventing conflicts from arising. So the ex-ante conflict prevention, right? Like before we even get to the dispute settlement phase, like how do we arise problems from, how do we prevent problems from arising in the first place? And one example of that is in the community, I mean, some of you will be familiar, the MEV case, right? Maximal extractable value. So interestingly, I mean, for those who don't know, I don't want to get into too much in detail, but because Ethereum public blockchain, there's this waiting room called the mempool. That's where like your transactions wait for like 12 seconds before they are processed by a block validator, right? And because this information is there, people have found ways to exploit it. So like sandwich attacks, front running, people submitting transactions just before your, token swap order, for instance. And there was some estimate in 2024 that it could cost up to $1 billion. And I remember there was a website where people tracked MEV, the value lost to MEV, but it's not there anymore. And interestingly, the community decided, that this is exploitative. There was a broad agreement within the Ethereum community, but I mean also Solana, other EVM chains, that this is exploitative. People are being taken advantage of. Bad forms of MME, of course, there are also good forms. And people found solutions. So now we have like private relays, like flash bots, for instance. And now transactions go through them. It's actually 80% of all transactions. I just looked up on Dune, and probably more for like percentage of trading volume. So the MEV problem has been kind of solved. And that's an example of ex-ante, And simultaneously, and we published about it on the Alness very recently, there's a court case in the US that's where these two brothers who were involved in, MEV now are being accused of wire frauds. So like, fraud with the internet, essentially. The Americans call it wire fraud. So obviously that's a case that I think the community has pretty much solved. I mean, there are still other solutions in place, but so now we see the court stepping in. So that's interesting, right? So I'm not saying that DeFi is completely immune to the state systems. No, private order like those that you mentioned, for instance, there are more examples, right? There are money markets in Kabul. There's an interesting paper on that by Nafai Chaudhry. One of my assessors, Florian Girsal, has this book on the fissures of Marseille. All of those communities, private orders, they still deal with the state somehow. Sometimes the state steps in. Sometimes these communities, ask for help from the state as last resort. So we know, for instance, like Zach XBT, he does amazing work. And then sometimes he shares his findings with, say, the French police, for instance. That was the case, I think, last year or the year before. And then the French police intervene and arrest this, crypto criminal. So that's like an example where, the states and private orders can work together as they come into clash sometimes as well. And for Kleros, the interesting thing, of course, it's, I mean, you mentioned the token dispute resolution, but it also exports decisions, justice to state court systems, right? Like the state court systems also recognize, just as they do with private arbitration, There are cases of like Mexico, Colombia. Maybe you can talk about them. So that's also interesting how now the community has not only developed these mechanisms to resolve its own disputes, but also expanded to other areas that are not only related to DeFi and manages to export externally. And that we see that with other private orders as well, that they can cooperate with state systems. So the point I want to make here is that it's not a antagonistic clash, but there are a lot of overlaps.
I speak to lots of people from arbitration regulators. We have discussed with the UNCITRAL. We have helped make the rules of arbitration. We have advised the ICC in France. So, and one of the things I sometimes tell them, so it's something like follows. So we will help you a lot resolve the disputes happening in this world of digital transactions, DeFi, metaverse, if you want to call it that way. So because we are like native from this other world, and you will still, you will still have a dispute, happening in the real, mid world, and that's still going to be there. But the digital world has become a new jurisdiction, and you need like a native system for resolving that. And this is kind of a private ordering coming from Kleros as a legal order. So this is what I sometimes discuss with regulators, and I don't want to. We could stay for hours discussing. Just one last question for now, and we will have you back in a few months, so you can tell us a bit about the progress that you're doing.
Yep.
Tell us, from a practical perspective. So, what are the steps in your doctorate? You're starting, and what does it look like for your roadmap? Towards the dissertation.
So academia moves very slow. I had this book idea already separately, but if you want to be taken seriously by scholarship, the scholarly communities, and if you want to publish with a university publisher, then you need to have your output supervised and have its academic quality confirmed by an institution. So and then that world moves very slowly, unlike DeFi. So I'm collecting data for 1 year. That's what I've been asked. And come October, I will start submitting chapters that will then turn into a book. And I will be assessed on it again by 2 assessors, and then a final assessment. Then there will be external assessors who are experts on private orders and also blockchain law and that sort of stuff. And then hopefully that will turn into a book. And the practical implication of this research is also this. So you talked about Ed Stringham's book on private governance, which covers financial institutions and how they emerge as private clouds. Historically, states have co-opted the rules that were organically generated by communities. So the financial regulation in the US, for instance, has absorbed some of those rules, like the membership rules in the New York Stock Exchange, for instance. They've been transported to financial regulation. So hopefully one takeaway will be, if the states recognize that, the blockchain community have built a private order, maybe then the state, instead of superimposing regulation, it will, understands its internal logic and, have those regulations, if necessary, transported into state regulation. So hopefully that's one, practical takeaway. So 1 year of data collection, and I'll be doing like background writing and all that meanwhile, but the biggest chunk of writing is starting September. So that's how it goes. I'd like to do it as soon as possible, as I told them, because unlike other type of research that other people may be doing, DeFi moves at an incredible speed. Blockchains, things change very fast, but so we obviously had like a massive liquidation recently. We had the balancer hack, so all those things will be going into my research now, how the community responded, and same with the Kleros cases that I'll be seeing as a juror myself, and look forward to chatting with those in the community as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any question. If somebody wants to reach out privately as well, please do so.
Yeah, just one last thing. I mean, how can the community help you? I mean, people from the community watch this stream, and then how can they reach to you? Is there anything specific you need from the community to help you with your research? I mean, yeah.
Reach out to me privately and just throw your ideas at me, based on what we've discussed, and I'll follow up with questions. It's very, I mean, we can also anonymize you if you don't, want to reveal your name or whatever. That's completely fine. It's very informal. I mean, I'm just saying it so that you don't feel, pressure to turn it into a formal presentation. And I'd love to include, interesting, insightful contributions into this book, because, the contribution will be as strong as, the community the book is trying to cover, not just the Kleros community, but also, the wider blockchain community. But also the critics, as you said, some people will say the Kleros is not private arbitration, so their voices also need to be included and analyzed as well. So anyone remotely interested and have some thoughts on anything like code as law, private orders, and dispute resolution, or alternative resolution mechanisms, those things, just reach out, and I think whatever your contribution will be, like I'll just trust me to steer the conversation and make it work. There's no process, there's no formality, but I'll assume that I have your consent if you reach out, because Oxford makes me say share with those that I collect data from, that I understand they are giving their consent and they can withdraw anytime.
Ekin, thank you very much for coming, and we will have you again in a few months, so we can learn a bit more about your program. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye bye.